Welcome, Dr. Epic here, and today we're going to discuss the sad story of segregated America. And we're going to watch as Jim Crow itself begins to crumble. And along the way, we'll meet the Tuskegee Airmen, talk about a short wait between trains, be introduced to the Dixiecrats, stare into an open coffin, experience a very odd school year, and finally meet a preacher newly arrived from Atlanta. We're going to follow that outline right up above my head. So put that in your notes to serve as a framework for the information that's about to follow as we continue to build an answer to that question on the lower left. Why did Martin Luther King Jr. succeed when others did not? What exactly was Jim Crow? What were the earlier strategies that fought it? How were King's tactics substantially different? Or was King just the collective accumulation of the long decades of the civil rights struggle? How did King change the country in a way that previous civil rights leaders did not? And as we start talking about Jim Crow and segregated America and civil rights, I do want to warn you that we are talking about a very ugly chapter in American history. And we're going to talk about some ugly things that happened during that period. So again, brace yourself for some of this ugliness that's about to follow, because we need to understand how this ugliness took place and how people destroyed Jim Crow in the end. Okay, by the time we get to 1954, Jim Crow has been the law of the land for nearly 60 years. Segregation now extended across the whole of the old Confederacy and even extended into states that had never been Confederate or really part of the South at all. And indeed, in some states like Texas and Arizona and California and Nevada, Jim Crow actually extended beyond African Americans as racially segregated laws began to apply to people of even Mexican descent. And efforts to curtail segregation in America had largely failed in the 20s and 30s and 40s, or had made such little progress as to be mostly ineffectual. And all of this comes from what happened after the Civil War, because after the Civil War, the federal government had made distinct promises to African Americans that they would be treated fairly, that they would be allowed to vote, that they would be considered equal citizens in the American Republic. And at least initially, the federal government backed these promises up because these promises were made manifest in a series of changes to the United States Constitution itself. 3 new constitutional amendments, collectively known as the Reconstruction Amendments. And these are the 13th Amendment, which outlaws slavery and any form of indentured servitude, the 14th Amendment, that all citizens receive equal treatment under the law, and the 15th Amendment, that all citizens have an equal right to vote, regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Yet, the Reconstruction Amendments were largely ignored across the South, which locked African Americans into this harshly segregated world called Jim Crow. Jim Crow intended to keep Black Americans poor, uneducated, and subservient to the rich planter whites of the South. After all, the South still depended on the labor of African American sharecroppers. Jim Crow was used to keep African Americans trapped inside a system that used their labor, yet denied them the fruits of their labor. Such segregation was blatantly illegal. It was a clear violation of the 14th Amendment. Yet the Supreme Court held that such segregation was constitutional. It was legal. And they did this in the very infamous case of Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896. Because in the 19th century, the Supreme Court basically said, we are not going to defend civil rights. Jim Crow, the Supreme Court upheld, was completely constitutional. And the Jim Crow world was built. The Jim Crow world existed sustained by violence. And the edges of the Jim Crow world were harshly policed by both violence from the police or unofficially by violence from the Ku Klux Klan or just white mobs who were, never prosecuted for murdering these people. And Jim Crow established its ugliness across the southern third of the country. People fought against Jim Crow, and many of these early civil rights leaders found their efforts stymied or they made very little progress against it. This included Walter White of the NAACP, and his tactic to defeat Jim Crow was through litigation, slow litigation, suing Jim Crow to death, winning a court case here, a little court case over there, a little statute over here. That's how the NAACP was going to slowly wear down Jim Crow. This frustrated W.E.B. Du Bois, that's him right there. And W.E.B. Du Bois wanted activism. He wanted social activism, registering people to vote, uncovering the violence of Jim Crow. And then came Booker T. Washington. There's Booker T. Washington. Now, Booker T. Washington said, look, we cannot cure the South of its racism, at least not yet. The best we can do is live inside this ugly system. And that was Booker T. Washington's approach, to accommodate ourselves within this and gain economic power first, and then use that economic power to gain civil rights later. And then there's finally Marcus Garvey, right up above me. Marcus Garvey said, no, there is no changing America's ugly racist ways. There is no place for African Americans inside the United States. All we need to do is load ourselves on ships of the Black Star Line and leave the country entirely. But again, none of these early civil rights approaches made much headway against the ugliness and the hatefulness of the Jim Crow South. But as we get into the 1950s, it's not the same country that was around in the 1900s. The country had changed considerably by the 1950s. The country had gone through two massive crises that, where the country had to really question like what it was. And the first of these is, of course, the Great Depression itself of the 1930s. And the Great Depression basically just leveled American society. And one of the weird things that happens during the Great Depression is actually race relations get better during the Great Depression, because nobody really had anything to compete over. Everyone was reduced to the same level of poverty and destitution. Everyone had the same thing, which was nothing. And people remembered who saved New York City. They remembered the kitchens of Father Divine, who fed New York when it had begun to starve. Father Divine, who said, we have to hug racism to death. We have to love racism until it goes away. People remembered these things. And then there came the war itself, which had profoundly changed American culture, and in fact probably unified the United States in a way that it had never been unified before, and almost certainly hasn't been unified since. People had to work together to get the country through the war. Rich and poor and northerner and southerner and westerner and black and white all had to work together to defeat Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. And there emerged from World War II enormously heroic African-American veterans. Indeed, the first hero of World War II is African-American. There he is, right up above my little yellow box. Dory Miller, who basically defended this battleship on Pearl Harbor pretty much by himself. He saved this huge battleship, USS West Virginia, I believe. But Dory Miller wasn't alone. A large number of African Americans served very honorably and very bravely. And I'm just going to mention some of them in passing. Right up there on the upper left, that's the 761st Tank Battalion, the original Black Panthers. That's what they called their tanks. Fighting with George Patton across Central Europe. And there on the left, the very famous Tuskegee Airmen, these guys who flew these Mustang fighter planes over Italy and over Central Europe. They were called the Red Tails because they painted the tails of their plane red because it just looked badass. That's why they did it. But the Tuskegee Airmen were incredible. They had the highest escort rate of any fighter planes in World War II. And again, there's this question, why is Hitler bad? Why are we fighting Hitler? Well, Hitler has built this evil racist empire in Europe. And it caused Americans to kind of think, well, if Hitler's racism in Europe is bad, then what does that say about Jim Crow's racism in America? And black veterans and white veterans and America in general started to really question this. We have these utterly heroic African-American veterans, and they're fighting to destroy a racist system in Europe. Yet we have the same thing back in America. I love this picture on the lower left, The dude crossing out the Nazi eagle. Yet, after the war, many black veterans returned home to find themselves confined back to the ugly boundaries of Jim Crow. These African-American veterans had fought. They had defeated these racist empires overseas. They were lauded as war heroes in France and Britain. Yet back in the United States, they were expected to become meek and subordinate, to confine themselves into the Jim Crow South. And many veterans had to really fight to get their veterans benefits. And they had to fight in a way that white veterans did not. America didn't want to extend all of these veterans benefits to these heroic black veterans. And I'm going to tell you a story that exemplifies the enormous problems and the hypocrisy that happened during World War II. And this was an incident that was recorded towards the end of the war called A Short Wait Between Trains. It was published in the New Yorker magazine. Okay, basically back in the days when everybody took trains, sometimes you had to get off one train and wait in the station for the other train to come by. Then everybody would get on the second train, kind of like a layover. At any rate, there's this train going from point A to point B, and it stops and a bunch of people get off this train, and they're waiting for the train to come the other way to take them in the other direction. And this is a very small train station in the segregated South. And the people that get off this train include like a whole bunch of people: white veterans, white GIs, African-American soldiers. And the train also included a number of Nazi prisoners of war. But it was a very small train station, and it only had one restaurant. And the restaurant was segregated. So the black soldiers go into the restaurant. They're told they can't eat in the restaurant. They're given their food, and they're basically told to kind of just sit outside the restaurant and eat. And while these black veterans are eating outside the restaurant, one of them goes, you're kidding me. And he's looking in through a window. And the other black soldiers get up and look through the window, and they are utterly astonished to see the Nazi prisoners of war are being seated and served inside the restaurant. All right? So the country is treating these defeated Nazis better than its African-American soldiers. And this story was published, and the story was published expecting to generate a lot of outrage. And it did, because World War II forced America to take a long, deep look at itself in the mirror. And if defeating racist empires in Europe was a good thing, maybe we should defeat the racist empire in America. And with all the problems that the black veterans had, there was substantial sympathy from the white veterans who after all, had fought in the same war. And if Hitler's racism was evil, what about America's racism was evil? And these are photographs from 1946, right after the end of the war. Because what happened in 1946 is African-American vets began to be denied housing in the Bay Area. And they started protesting. And they were joined in their protest by white veterans who weren't being discriminated against. Because these veterans are like, these are my brothers in arms, regardless of their skin color. I mean, you can see them right there. The victory in World War II was forcing the country to take a very hard look at itself. And this is one of the reasons that you have so many of these civil rights leaders in the 1950s and 60s. So many of these guys are, in fact, World War II veterans. And I mean, you look at these photographs, everyone around me is a veteran from World War II. Ralph Abernathy, he was basically the right hand of Martin Luther King. He was a platoon sergeant in the Army. Medgar Evers over there on the upper left, the NAACP field representative in Mississippi. He had fought in the Battle of Normandy. He drove a truck the entire time. Jackie Robinson was a lieutenant in the 761st Tank Brigade, the Black Panthers. Hosea Williams there was in the Battle of the Bulge, and he got basically torn up by a Nazi bomb, and it almost blew his leg off. And Hosea Williams would walk with this really pronounced limp for the rest of his life. And Chauncey Eskridge over there on the lower left, one of Dr. King's main attorneys. Eskridge was a Tuskegee Airman. He flew one of the red-tailed Mustangs over Italy and over Central Europe. These guys are veterans. They're coming back to America, and they are beginning to attack the racism of the Jim Crow system. And nobody can question their patriotism. When people would call Hosea Williams, an American-hating communist, he would just wrap his leg and tap his Purple Heart. Medgar Evers would wear his campaign medals. These guys are American heroes, and they can't be accused of hating a country that they almost gave their lives to defend. And then, of course, comes Jackie Robinson. Jackie Robinson stands head and shoulders above other peoples at this time. And Jackie Robinson is an incredible individual. He's tall, he's athletic, he's good looking, he's educated. And in 1947, the National Baseball Commission chooses him in a deliberate attempt to desegregate baseball, to make one baseball team. And they picked Jackie Robinson specifically because he's very well mannered. And they say you're going to get called all kind of things when you step out onto that plate to play baseball, and you can't react. And Jackie Robinson knew he couldn't react. So Jackie Robinson stands out there to play baseball, and he's called all manner of pejoratives, and he just bears it. He doesn't get mad, he doesn't get angry, and he has a .311 batting average. So he is an incredible baseball player. And pretty much just through sheer charisma and personality alone, Jackie Robinson wins over every baseball fan in America. And by the time you get to 1948, 1949, he is one of the most popular men in America. And suddenly you've got all these vets that are rethinking this racism of America. You've got all these baseball fans that are rethinking the racism of America. And finally, these doubts reach the president himself. And in 1948, the first big cracks start to appear. Working with the NAACP, President Harry Truman integrates the federal government, and this includes the military. No more segregated military. Now, Truman did this for pragmatic political reasons, but there's no mistaking his authentic idealism in doing so. Truman himself was a veteran. He'd fought in World War I. He'd served along African-American soldiers, and the mistreatment that they were receiving when they returned to the United States, and the story, the short wait between trains, had really swayed Harry Truman. He was very sympathetic to the way that these black veterans were being mistreated, and he said, this has got to stop. Truman, he was a Southerner himself. He's from Missouri. He was no racist, and he ordered the integration of the Army, the Navy, and the entire federal government. Southern Democrats, Truman's own party, exploded in outrage. They charged that Truman had betrayed the South in creating this integrated military. And what really rankled them was now the idea that African-American officers were going to be in charge of white soldiers. This outraged the Southern Democrats. They broke from the Democratic Party and established their own short-lived splinter faction of the Democrats. They called themselves Dixiecrats, all caps. The Dixiecrats were a racist, pro-segregationalist political movement that aimed at unseating Harry Truman from the presidency in the 1948 election. That's all the Dixiecrats wanted to do, was to make sure that Truman was going to lose in the 1948 election. They actually nominated their own candidate, a guy named Strom Thurmond. They waved Confederate flags. They waved around portraits of Robert E. Lee. There's one of their campaign pins right up above my head. They intended to make Harry Truman pay for integrating the federal government. They failed spectacularly. Harry Truman is reelected in 1948, and it's a big surprise victory. Nobody expects really Harry Truman to win, and hence the very famous headline for the Chicago Daily Tribune over there, where they just said Dewey defeats Truman, and Harry Truman holds up the newspaper indicating the scale of his victory. And the Dixiecrats had been foiled. But the thing is that the results of the 1948 election actually provides a rough metric for basically the scale of racism in America in 1948. And what the numbers show is really interesting. Now, here are the percentages of each state that voted for the Dixiecrat Strom Thurmond in 1948. And, while not everybody that voted for Strom Thurmond was a racist, like an awful lot of them were. And, some racists did not vote for Thurmond, but it does give us a rough metric. It tells us something very interesting about racism, at least in 1948, because what seems to emerge from these numbers is that American racism was not very widespread. American racism was kind of loosely scattered out across the country, but concentrated in a very few areas. Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, Louisiana. But in the places where racism was concentrated, those places were very racist. Regardless, though, if you look at the entire country, what emerges is that these racists are in the clear minority. For the first time in the 1948 election, and perhaps for the first time in American history, a clear majority of Americans, more than 90%, supported candidates, either Harry Truman or Thomas Dewey, who were both committed to civil rights. This is something very new in American history. The country had changed considerably from back in the days of the Plessy decision of 1896. And as we move into the 1950s, the first big cracks in Jim Crow began to appear. Now again, for years, the NAACP had pursued a slow and patient legal strategy to break Jim Crow. They had won a series of small legal victories throughout the 1940s and 1950s, integrating a small university here or a college over there, or preventing official segregation on airplanes, for instance. And the guiding mind through these small legal victories was, of course, the greatest legal mind of America in the 20th century, a guy named Thurgood Marshall. But Marshall had set his sights on bigger and bigger goals. Marshall is like, we need a big victory. And he carefully focused on a case from Kansas. And they specifically picked Kansas because it wasn't part of the Old South. And it was a place where Jim Crow was not especially old or especially strong. And Marshall and the NAACP focus on the school boards in Kansas. So they bring this case to the Supreme Court. And nobody really expected much because, after all, the Supreme Court had declared segregation legal back in the Plessy decision of 1896. So nobody really expected Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP to win a big victory over this tiny little school board case from Kansas. But they won, and they won big. They won bigger than they possibly predicted. Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP won, and this is the very famous case of Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. They argue in front of the Supreme Court. Thurgood Marshall there gives a brilliant attack on the Jim Crow laws on segregated schools, and the Supreme Court agrees. The entire Supreme Court agrees. And in a surprise unanimous decision, the Supreme Court reversed its 1896 ruling. They declared Jim Crow is unconstitutional. The 1896 Plessy decision was wrong. Racial segregation in schools was ruled unconstitutional, and public schools in the South, across the entire South, were told to integrate with all due haste. The South explodes. Remember that racism isn't everywhere. It's in a few places, but in those places, it's intensely concentrated. It's intensely racist. And these places exploded in outrage. We want to keep our schools white, they argued and protested. Race mixing is communism, they said. And I'm not going to read those signs on the lower left. They are incredibly outraged. They refuse to integrate schools across the South. And indeed, Virginia launched this program called Massive Resistance, that when the federal courts would order a school to be racially integrated, they would just close the entire school. And in parts of Virginia and in parts of South, they had sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 years without public education of any kind. Many parts of the South were willing to have no education at all, rather than have a racially integrated education. And in the middle of all of this debate, in the middle of this, just after the Brown decision, in the middle of this intense debate over schools, comes the murder of Emmett Till. That is Emmett Till. He was 14 years old. Now, this is a really sad story, so brace yourself. Okay, Emmett Till is 14 years old. He's from Chicago, all right? And he was visiting his cousins down in Mississippi when they were in a general store. And he was basically showing off in front of his Mississippi cousins. And he begins flirting with a young married white woman, being like really inappropriate towards her. And his cousins are horrified, utterly horrified. Black men do not talk to white women in 1955 Mississippi that way. And in fact, an older black man basically grabs Emmett Till and is like, you need to leave now. And they have to hide him. And he goes to the family and he's like, you've got to hide this kid and you've got to get him out of the state as soon as possible. And they try to do that, but they're not successful. Emmett Till vanishes on August 28th, and no one will ever see him alive again. 3 days later, his body washes ashore on the Tallahatchie River. Emmett Till had been murdered. He'd been kidnapped off the streets of Mississippi. He'd been severely beaten and tortured, and then finally shot in the head and then dumped in the river. The nation was completely and utterly shocked. All right, and this gained a level of outrage and a level of publicity that, say, Jesse Washington back, in 1915 did not. I mean, he was 14, all right? And he was just murdered. And they knew the two white men that had done it. The two white men are arrested, they're put on trial, and an all-white jury, see over there on the lower left, finds them, it acquits them, finds them not guilty, even though everybody knew they did it. It is absolutely outrageous. The president himself, President Eisenhower by this time, is completely outraged at the complete murder of this 14-year-old boy. His body is brought back to Chicago. And then his mother does something really, really outrageous. His mother does something that no one expected. Emmett Till had been beaten. He'd been tortured for hours. He'd been shot in the head. He'd been thrown in the river, and he was in that river 3 days. Emmett Till's mother decided on two things. One, that they were going to have a public funeral in Chicago, and tens of thousands of people went to pay their respects to Emmett Till. Tens of thousands of people, black and white, all went to the funeral of Emmett Till. And the second thing his mother decided, she decided on an open casket funeral. And people were like, are you sure you want to do this? Because the body was not in good condition at all. And she insisted on an open casket because, and that's her quote there on the lower left, I just wanted the world to see. She wanted to show the world what those racists down in Mississippi had done to her little boy. And she does more than just have a public open casket funeral where tens of thousands of people stare at the mutilated remains of Emmett Till. She has photographs of his body published. Now, they're published in Jet magazine. Now, I thought about this a lot. This went over and over and over in my head. And eventually I came to the conclusion that I am not going to show you pictures of the body of Emmett Till. Even though that's what his mother wanted people to see the images. But I'm not going to do that. They're too shocking, even for this little, PowerPoint, even for this little lecture. I'm not going to show you pictures of what was in that tiny coffin. If you are interested, you can look them up yourself. It's ugly. It's bad. It's bad. Okay? And if anybody ever approaches you and says, oh, racism this and racism that, and oh, all that racism and ugliness, that happened years and years and years and years ago, just point out that that is the memorial to Emmett Till that is in Mississippi. It is regularly vandalized, all right? That photograph right up above me is from 2017, where people have gone to the memorial of Emmett Till and shot it dozens and dozens of times. So the racism is still out there. It's still an ugly world. And it's so ugly that the state of Mississippi has had to recently erect a new memorial to Emmett Till. There it is right there. It's like an 800-pound sheet of steel that is like massive. It's supposed to be impermeable to vandalism, and it's got to be bulletproof. Mississippi had to raise a bulletproof memorial to Emmett Till. All right? The racism is out there. It's still out there. It just hides a little bit better than it used to. Now, the NAACP is on a roll. They've won the Brown decision. They're going to press forward for the desegregation of schools across the South. And even though the Supreme Court told Southern schools to integrate in all due haste, the South had delayed the decision for 3 years, and they couldn't put it off anymore. So in August of 1957, the NAACP selected 9 students to begin the desegregation of Southern schools. There they are, right up above my head. And this was in accordance with the Supreme Court's Brown decision. So they select these 9 students because they're smart, they're articulate, they're well-behaved. They are told, just like Jackie Robinson, do not respond to provocation. So they selected these 9 students who became known as the Little Rock Nine. And they set up this plan with the federal government. They set up this plan with President Eisenhower. They set up the plan with the federal court system. And they set up this plan with the Arkansas state government. And after initially agreeing with this plan, the Arkansas governor, a guy who's got this crazy name, Orville Faubus, reneged on his promises. Pressured by segregationists, Governor Faubus activated the Arkansas National Guard. There you see them right there. He surrounded Arkansas's Central High School with armed soldiers to prevent the Little Rock Nine from attending school. The entire nation just gasps in horror to see these images of these really embarrassed soldiers who are standing and preventing children from going to school. And remember, this is right after the murder of Emmett Till. So those images are in people's minds when they see this. And Eisenhower hears about this decision and loses it. President Eisenhower, he succeeded Truman, was absolutely outraged at Arkansas's actions, which are illegal. All right, what the governor of Arkansas was doing was illegal. President Eisenhower declares Arkansas to be in a state of insurrection against the federal government, and he invokes military powers that had not been used since the days of the Civil War. Eisenhower nationalized the Arkansas National Guard, and he dispatches the 101st Airborne into the high school. There are the paratroopers arriving to guard a high school. For an entire year, the Little Rock Nine walked to school escorted by paratroopers with loaded rifles. These huge racist mobs would emerge. There you see them, declaring that race mixing is communism, flying Confederate flags, and they would march towards these 9 students who were just trying to go to class. But you see that there's the paratroopers guarding the students right up above me. And every time these racist mobs would surge towards the students, there's the 101st Airborne right there. They would put bayonets on the end of their rifles and point them directly at the racist mob. And if the racist mob was getting really, really angry and really boisterous, they would load a round into their assault rifles. They were playing for keeps. This is the elite unit of the U.S. Army, or one of the most elite units in the U.S. Army. And they had to ask the soldiers to escort them to the bathroom and stuff. It was absolutely bonkers. And immediately parallels are made with what happened during the Reconstruction of the 1870s. Back during Reconstruction, it was the Army that protected the African Americans from the racist mobs. Just like they did it in 1870, they were doing it in 1955 Arkansas. It was an odd school year, to say the least, all right? These 9 Little Rock students, they would go everywhere. They would have a lieutenant who's asking them where they're going because they have to be escorted by armed soldiers the entire time. They walk to school with armed soldiers. There's armed soldiers in the hall of the high school. They're guarding the doors behind at every classroom. There's paratroopers. They have to be escorted to the bathroom with paratroopers. And these 9 students received enormous amounts of abuse from the white racist students. They tried to set one of them on fire at one point. It was ugly stuff. I mean, you look at that image right up above me, and the Little Rock 9 were told to be little Jackie Robinsons. Don't respond. Be stoic. Endure the abuse, all right? Because we know what they're being yelled. We know what they're being called. And if you're interested in the experience of the Little Rock 9 and exactly what happened inside the Central High School of Little Rock, Melba Beals wrote that book on the upper left, Warriors Don't Cry. It's actually quite good. And one of the things that Beals talks about is that there actually weren't that many racist students, but the racist students just broadcast their hate at every opportunity. And one of the things she mentioned is that there were white students that were very, very sympathetic towards them, that tried to make friends with the black students. And those students were beaten by their racist companions, because even sympathetic white students, those guys weren't getting guarded by, paratroopers. So the small core of racist students patrolled behavior among the white students. And for an entire year, they made basically no friends. They expelled one of the Little Rock 9 because she got mad and dumped a bowl of chili on top of one of the racists. So she's out. It was intensely weird. I don't know how they learned anything. And they are denied a second school year. For 1958, Governor Favis just closes the entire school rather than desegregate. They put up this very disingenuous sign: "This school closed by the order of the federal government." Wasn't closed by the order of the federal government. The federal government just said it is illegal to racially segregate. But they would rather close the entire school than have racially integrated education. And indeed, this is called the lost year. And many, high school students just didn't go to high school that year. And basically, the parents flip out. The parents decide this is not that big a deal. And they change the entire school board. And the entire local school board forces the governor to reopen schools in 1959. But the Little Rock 9 had won. The NAACP had won at Little Rock. A precedent had been set. Segregation was illegal. Segregation was unconstitutional. And the federal government would use its power to integrate local schools. Although, by the time you get to 1958, nobody really knows what that means. But this is the NAACP's winning ticket. And this is what they proceed to do, pretty much for the next few years, focusing on schools, focusing on education, getting African-American college students into law schools, getting African-American students into college. And here's the very, very famous case of James Meredith. And they got him into Mississippi State University, known as Old Miss, the rebels themselves. And there was like a riot, and they had to bring in federal police to escort him from class to class to class. But it was a winning strategy. The racists were slowly losing. And the NAACP and James Meredith integrated the colleges and universities of Mississippi. And there were lots of protests. It wasn't just protests against segregation. There was protests wasn't just protests for segregation. It was protests against segregation. There we have the St. Louis NAACP integrating the schools of Missouri. There are black students showing up at majority white schools that would soon be racially mixed schools. And you can see, not all of these white students are yelling and heaping abuse on the black students, because for all of the storm and the fury and the racism and the ugliness, like when you get down to it, especially little kids don't care about that stuff. All right. They integrated, the elementary schools of the South to only discover, they get along just fine. And this is the real indictment of racism. I mean, we can talk about justice and we can talk about natural rights and the role of the government and Thomas Jefferson and Thurgood Marshall. But ultimately, the ultimate condemnation of racism is little kids don't have it. All right. The hatred of racism has to be taught. All right. If left alone, little kids just play with each other. They're just little kids. All right. And once the schools were integrated, they generally flowed pretty well. All right. Little kids are not racist. But many people were growing dissatisfied with the NAACP's go slow it approach. The NAACP is like, look, we've got a good thing here. All right. We're doing the schools. All right. We won this big court case in 1954. We're just going to slowly go from school to school to school. And then after the schools, we're going to do another part of society. And after that part, we're going to do a third part and then a fourth part. And if it takes 30 years, then it takes 30 years. But not everybody was on board with that. They're saying, look, we've got a big crack in Jim Crow. We need to try and widen that crack. They wanted a more activist demolition of Jim Crow. And this included members of the NAACP itself. Okay, so you've got the NAACP chapter in Montgomery, Alabama. They pointed out that, look, all of this started with the Plessy decision back in 1896. And the Plessy decision concerned public transportation. Now, in 1896, that was trains. But by the time we get to, the 1950s, people are riding on buses. So the chapter in Montgomery points out, okay, if the Supreme Court has overturned the 1896 Plessy decision, it should extend to more than just public education. It should extend to public transportation, okay? If Brown overturned Plessy, public transportation should be desegregated then. Logically, yes. All right? So we should now press to desegregate public transportation. The NAACP urged caution. Let's go it very, very slow, all right? And people are like, we don't want to go slow, NAACP. And the NAACP was like, okay, let me tell you a story. There was a hare that challenged a tortoise to a race. And they're like, we understand, we know the story, NAACP. But that's a fable, and this is real life. We are going to press ahead for the desegregation of public transportation in the South. So, on December 1st, 1955, the secretary for the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP, there she is right up above me, and her name is Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks boards a city bus and sits in the middle section that was basically a sort of an overflow section. And when the bus starts to fill up, a white man gets on the bus and asks her to move. She refuses. She is, of course, arrested because it's against the law in Montgomery. And this was all planned. It wasn't a spontaneous decision on Rosa Parks' part. They knew she was going to get on the bus. They knew she would be arrested, and they were waiting with lawyers at the police station because they want to use her arrest as a pretext to integrate the Montgomery bus system. And if they don't get their way, they're going to engage in a huge boycott of the Montgomery bus system. And they even had a figurehead picked out for this boycott because recently arrived in the city of Montgomery was a young, charismatic reverend who had just shown up from Atlanta. And his name was Martin Luther King Jr. He was 26 years old. And what Dr. King does in Montgomery? We'll get to that next time. And I will see you there.